This is Space Minds by Space News. In this episode, co-host David Ariosto talks with Sara Alvarado, Executive Director for the Students for the Exploration and Development of Space, known as SEDS. Our hosts then discuss the latest news, including the confirmation hearing for NASA Administrator nominee Jared Isaacman.
Sara, it is a pleasure to see you again.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah, I was so excited about this conversation because I find what you do so very important in terms of sort of the long-term structure of both the space industry and this country and sort of where we're all headed. But if you allow me, just like for the audience, maybe just give a little bit of a background. You're the executive director of SEDS, which, if I can explain that, it's basically a nonprofit called the Students for the Exploration and Development of Space. And it's the world's largest student-run space organization. It's been around since like the 1980s. And the idea, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is to sort of fuel the space economy or space agencies or research centers with new talent and sort of this pipeline kind of approach. Am I close?
No, yeah, you got it right. And I'll add in that we are student-led and student-run. So outside of myself and our webmaster, even our board of directors and our volunteer staff at the national level are all students.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about what you actually do there in terms of the competitions, in terms of the grants, but especially in terms of like the nature of the technology that some of these students are engaged in. I think the last time we spoke, we were talking about reusable rocketry and self-landing rockets and sort of like advanced concepts that you might not immediately think of at the collegiate level.
Yeah, absolutely. So space science at the university level has advanced so much over the years, and we're seeing a really big boom and interest in different universities, even in universities that no longer had or that never had an engineering program.
Yeah.
So what we do at SEDS is through different opportunities, we help make those projects happen. Some key projects that I'm so excited about, you mentioned the reusability one, that's from UCSD. We have our Portland State chapter who built Portland's first CubeSat. They've built this kit that can be built by middle school and high school students. It's a portable ground station, and they connect. So the high school will talk to the university chapter. They'll let them know where they'll be and at what time. The university chapter will then send them this kit. They'll build it themselves, and then they face it up towards the sky and are able to get a 10-minute direct link to their cell phone of what that satellite is seeing. So it's a giant selfie from space, and it's helping the community embrace space science. So a lot of the work that we do is at that cutting edge of collegiate science, but it involves a lot of the community, because what we know is that reaching back and helping the next generations helps in terms of increasing awareness of opportunities in space, not just aerospace engineers are what needed. So Ed says we take a lot of pride in being able to help those sort of organizations and situations.
And what I found was interesting about this too is in terms of how this sort of fits in with your own personal story. And I wonder if you can kind of just maybe walk us through this a little bit, because you describe an interest in space at an early age, and yet also this almost roadblock or this hurdle that you weren't quite sure that you'd be able to clear by virtue of maybe there's a sort of the lack of a program or the sort of the nature or maybe the lack of the infrastructural sort of situational foundation that would maybe traditionally propel people into careers in space. So walk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, well, I'm originally from Bogota, Colombia, and at that time we didn't have any sort of space footprint. So
That's
when
changing
we
a
were
little bit now, right? With some of these like nano satellites, Earth observation components, but certainly back
yes,
then not.
yes, now there are universities building CubeSats in Colombia, which is amazing. But um, when I went to college, I also didn't think by then that dream of becoming an astronaut for me, which I know many children share, for me was just not something that I thought was attainable. So I studied economics and industrial engineering, and I would attend my SEDS chapter meetings for the free pizza and to talk about space history. But it wasn't until the opportunity came up to become the national treasurer for SEDS, and I thought, well, I have this economics background, and I've been meaning to truly give back to this organization that has helped me feel like I can still share my passion for space in some way. And I applied and I got it, and I did so much impactful work that really created ripple effects for what we could do in the future for helping students and their projects. So then I applied for the chair and I got that. And then somehow along the way, I became the executive director, and that's what I do now. And my
Your own
background,
background, though, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm just going to say your own background in economics. I mean, yes, you had the industrial engineering background, but I think that that's a really kind of interesting wrinkle in all this, because I think when a lot of people think of the space industry, they think of astronauts or they think of aerospace engineers, and the nature of people with backgrounds in economics or finance or digital marketing or healthcare or nursing or just like it almost strikes me as that not only is the space so widened so exponentially in recent years, but the pipeline is now starting to marry to that, or at least it should be. And your role seems to be very much at the vanguard of that.
yes. Yeah. And I think also to add to that is the idea that now are the technologies that were developed for space are impacting so many other industries and markets
Yeah.
that people that decided, I'm going to study finance for X or Y or Z reasons are being pulled into space or vice versa. So it's definitely not so much the same story now of you have to be an aerospace engineer. And I think the younger generations are starting to realize that. And that goes along with not just what we're seeing at the university level, but being a nonprofit, we've been able to partner with some great other nonprofit organizations. One that I will call out is last year we worked with the Colorado Council of Black Nurses, who happen to have an aerospace branch. And they work with universities and colleges in the area to teach space medicine to nurses. So thinking about how these little pockets are springing in different space hubs and how that's going to impact the generations after us is something that I'm really excited about.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was another point that you and I have talked about in the past. In the sense is there sort of that, despite all the progress, despite the widening of the industry, and the fact that you have companies now like Toyota who are exploring sort of the satellite wherewithal, or companies like Walmart or Target that are sort of like monitoring the parking lots during holiday traffic season via satellites to kind of get a sense of their customer base and their rivals. And so like this idea that this space industry is widening beyond the Boeings and the SpaceX is all exciting. But I remember looking at this UN study it was just a couple years ago, and it was pointing to the numbers of women in the space sector, and it was about 1 in 5. And that was interesting in the context also of the fact that number was pretty much the same as it was about 30 years ago. So despite some of this progress, there seems to be this gap that just is persistent. And I wonder if you could address that and sort of what you've seen.
Absolutely. And in a lot of our leadership in sets, we see some of that most leaders are still the men. But I would counter that in the chapters where we have female leaders, whether it's presidents, directors of projects, what we see is a greater sense of community. And we see a continuation of promoting more female leadership. So I'll call out UCSD. Not only are they doing amazing things with rockets, but they also created SEDS Her, which is a purely mentorship program for women in SEDS, but also for women in AIAA at that university and a few other STEM organizations there. So that was developed by their president, who happens to be a woman. And that's one example. We also have Texas A&M, who partner a lot with the NESB chapter because it started through Callie Wynn, a president who is now doing kinesiology. So even if we're seeing still similar numbers in terms of representation, I think women are being able to cultivate this community and therefore increasing this awareness that potentially might not have been done, otherwise. And I will say from my own journey, being a woman and being a minority, there's this sense of self-selection, of thinking, I'm not going to meet those standards, or why would I even try? I'm not going to get it. And I myself had to go through that when I decided to run for treasurer. But it really came back to discussing with my male counterparts that I had this idea, and they were my allies, very supportive. And I think that that's what the men can do in these sort of situations. It's help uplift those voices so that we can create a greater sense of diversity, and then be much more strategic about how we approach different problems from different angles. So I will finish off with saying that as taking a wider approach and thinking about our civilization, if we can fully share that sense of not feeling like we're the adequate person for the job, if we're all sharing that, then maybe we can all bond on that and help uplift each other.
You make a great point, and I also sort of would reiterate that space seems different in terms of the community aspect. And just from my own experience, i- there are certain professions out there that are singular in focus or individualistic in focus, and you're sort of working towards a goal that might benefit yourself or your family or sort of the broader nature of your industry in the abstract. But so many of these factories, space factories that I've been to, or research labs, have this sense of a community and this team working together in this broader goal. And there's not a lot of interpretation whether or not a rocket takes off or not, or whether it lands on the moon or not. It's less subjective, I guess, in that sense. And so this like collective sense that you see in rocket factories that also maybe translates directly into terms of the educational pipeline that you're fostering. It just strikes me that that connection is somewhat unique in this emerging industry.
Yes, I agree. And what's amazing about what we're able to do at SEDS is students will be studying orbital dynamics or fluids in the day, and then in the evening they'll be putting together proposals for projects, planning out projects, developing that teamwork and those leadership skills. So it's really creating a well-rounded individual that knows how to work as a team. And truly, in space, no one person can do it all.
Yeah.
What we've been able to achieve here in the US, and really as a civilization, is amazing, but it definitely takes a village.
So now I want to push back a little bit on sort of a question for you. Um,
Yeah.
when we look at the broader competitive landscape, um, you think about, particularly in this country, America's sort of long-term competitiveness in space, and I'm talking about principally STEM education. There's not really a comprehensive national science and technology strategy. And if you look at the numbers across other industrialized nations, American students often perform worse than their peers in comparison, especially with dealing with critical math and hard science knowledge. I, I get the sense that as diversified as the approach is in terms of the content creators and the financial aspects, there's also sort of a core fundamental aspect of STEM as it relates to space. And if you look at sort of the long-term trends and real questions about competitiveness long term, how do we address this? Like how do we start to kind of right the ship a little bit?
An excellent question. I think that there's no one answer. Just like anything, it's a systematic approach. What
Mm.
we're able to do at SETS is provide that hands-on experience. Many people say what you study kind of goes out the window until you get 2 years of real world experience. So we're able to provide that real world experience of being able to apply the equations that you're studying, the theory that you're learning, and to seeing how it actually works. Um, so what we're what when we develop that pipeline, we are focusing on being able to attract a variety of majors so that we can stay competitive.
Yeah.
And I think that the projects that we support at the national level stay to maintain that competitiveness. We focus on a wide variety. So not only are we supporting rockets, we're also supporting policy projects, we're supporting CubeSats, so that we're able to interact with the space sector and fuel the space sector through that pipeline in all the different elements that compromise the space industry.
You know, I'm out here in Arizona, and Arizona State University has a pretty robust science and space exploration program. And I remember going and visiting and seeing some of these students who are just like 18 years old, who are working on CubeSats and you know, partnerships with NASA on some of these broader missions. And it makes me think I kind of slacked off in, in college by comparison, because it's just extraordinary. It's extraordinary, like the extent of which the knowledge base is sort of trickling down to even that collegiate and even high school levels. I mean, is that kind of where it starts? You sort of have to germinate those seeds early. And also I wonder if you can kind of speak to the importance of mentorship in this, and sort of like seeing people who you want to be like, and then sort of manifesting through that.
Yes. Well, many of our chapters work with the high schools in their area because they themselves were interested in space when they were high schoolers. And I have many high school students reach out to me and either form chapters at the high school level, which we have a few, or ask me, hey, I'm graduating this year. Where can I go? How do I get in contact with a SEDS chapter? So the interest is definitely there. And now as the technology advances, there's more opportunity for high schoolers to take on projects and not feel like you mentioned, like they're slacking off when they get to college. So whether it's programming or hackathons, there's definitely a lot of opportunities. Something that is very important to us when we promote the projects and when we support projects that our chapters are doing is that they continue that community component, whether it's through mentorship, like you said, by bringing projects to the high schools and showing them how things work, or including some of those students K through 12. It doesn't just have to be high schools, but including the younger generations in the engine testing and in the different testings or different milestones. And what we see is this pipeline grows even further to not just be, once they enter the university, but much earlier. There's a lot of different projects out there for high school students. And I will add here that if you're still in Arizona next year, that's where we'll be hosting our conference, Space Vision, and we would love to have you.
Excellent. Oh, I'd be pleasured. It's such important work you do. Sara Alvarado, Executive Director of SEDS, thank you so much for joining us here on Space Minds.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Now for Space Takes, where our hosts tackle the buzziest industry topics.
Mike, what have we got going on this week?
Well, I think there's a couple items we're going to want to talk about today that are going to have some medium to long-term implications, but we're starting to see them get a little bit of momentum right now. So let's start first with Jared Isaacman. He's the Trump nominee to be the NASA administrator. He was one of the earliest nominees. President Trump announced in December that that's who he wanted to run NASA. In February, we heard that there was a holdup with some paperwork. And just last week, we heard from about roughly 30 NASA astronauts who said, hey, let's get this moving. It was a letter to the Senate, and they just said, hey, we're endorsing Jared Isaacman as the next administrator. Please get this going as quickly as possible. He brings credibility and capability to the job. So that was an interesting, not unheard of, but just an interesting development. And it came just a couple weeks after Jim Bridenstine, the former NASA administrator, said, hey, the sooner Jared gets confirmed, the better NASA is going to be. So it's been an interesting couple of weeks just kind of watching this. The thinking is just, hey, this process is taking longer than expected. Isaacman himself has been fairly quiet, except for a few comments here and there on social media. But I think what's interesting to watch is just any kind of broader changes that maybe the administration or people were expecting to happen in NASA. I think there's a sense that this isn't really going to happen until he's in place, and that hasn't happened. And for all of the kind of head start that seemed to be taking place in December, now things are slowing down, and it doesn't look like there's going to be that advantage of time there.
Yeah. It does seem like we're guessing a little bit in absence
Yeah.
of clear leadership, right? Because like there's been all sorts of prognosticators, myself included, among the worst offenders, in terms of where sort of reading the tea leaves and speaking to those inside the agency and kind of those outside and trying to get a sense of where we're going and the influence of Elon Musk in the White House and what's been said during the second inaugural address. And we're all just sort of kind of piecing together these clues and making our own deductions, but without sort of clear leadership at the top. It's hard to know in terms of what their policy priorities are and then where the budget goes. But I think there's also something else that's going on here because I mean one of those people that wrote that letter was Garrett Reisman, who, as you know, flew on 3 space shuttle missions. Of course, he also joined Elon Musk at SpaceX, where he served in a variety of different capacities, including the director of space operations. So I don't know if this is your sense, Mike, but I do get the sense that maybe there is this certain recognition within the industry that a lot of the space future is almost inherently tied to SpaceX in some ways, given how influential that company is, where Elon Musk is now positioned. And you see things like reports of SpaceX engineers being brought on as like senior advisors within the FAA, and there's just sort of this like broader sense of the influence of that company, and it's almost like if you want to be in space, it's hard to ignore that elephant in the room here, and certainly Derek Isaacman has longstanding ties to Musk and SpaceX, both with his companies and financially. So. I think there's like this duality here of like one, an absence of leadership and wanting to know where we're going by virtue of that policy directive and budget priorities that are tied to it, and two, the influence of a private company that I don't think we've ever seen before at this level within
No,
commercial space.
And I think the other part that goes along with that is, obviously Doge right now is a huge influence on what's happening with the federal government, and many of those Doge liaisons, Doge administrators, employees, many of them have ties to SpaceX. So yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I think specifically with Jared, there has been an optimism broadly throughout the space community that he might be the right person for the job. And so I think there is an excitement to kind of, hey, get this going, see how NASA can fare through this environment, and where, like you said, what the priorities will be and where the budget is.
And then
So
I mean, I was
go
just
ahead.
going to say, and then you also see, so you see the shifts within the agency and the shifts in terms of, how those priorities are going to be sussed out. But then you also see shifts overseas in
Yeah.
Europe and some of the changes that we've seen, maybe sort of as a result of the geopolitical conversations and strategic actions that have taken place. Like, you want to kind of fill us in
Yeah,
on that bit?
and I think that's the second part of where I think we're going to be watching over the next several months, if not maybe longer. But the European Space Agency last week released what they're calling a Strategy 2040 document, and they have 5 goals there: protecting the planet and climate, exploring and discovery, strengthening European autonomy and resilience, boosting European growth and competitiveness, and inspiring Europe. And you can hear those, but what my takeaway there was they don't necessarily mesh with U.S. goals. It doesn't mean that it's oil and water, but there's maybe they're not quite as neatly tied together as they once were. And the messaging that went along with this was specifically that word autonomy. And what it meant was, the way it was described was, hey, you can't rely solely on the United States or one country, one company to help make some of these goals possible. So I think that's a really interesting phrase we've heard a couple times from Europe and European companies now, and one to really listen for in the next couple months, that word autonomy and what it means. But You can also see protecting our planet and climate. That has not been something that the Trump administration has voiced a ton of support for. That European autonomy is not obviously something. There are clearly stressors right now on U.S. and European relationships right now. So I think this is going to be kind of an interesting area to watch. However, I'd add, like the U.S. space economy right now, some of the big movement appears to be in defense contracts. And so there was an interesting initiative, this Rearm Europe plan that was unveiled last week. It's a 800 billion euro, about $872 billion US dollars initiative to bolster defense. So a lot of folks in the space community are watching to see, hey, where's the money going to be for space there, and what might that mean for space companies both overseas and in Europe, and just a lot to watch and a lot to see how those phrases play out.
I guess the one thing I sort of wonder about is that, a big part of that shift has been sort of this integrating of commercial space into defense. And you do see the emergence of some really interesting European space companies. D-Orbit is one that we're set to speak with, actually.
Yeah.
But I also kind of wonder about, you see, I think when you look at commercial development, you see pockets and ecosystems that develop, and it's hard to replicate that overnight. I mean, the money is one part of it, right? I mean, clearly, $872 billion initiative is nothing to sneeze at, but the sort of the groups that sort of surround it, and the scientists and the researchers and the physicists and the engineers, and the ecosystems that tend to form in these pockets, that it's part of the reason why the superconductor industry in Taiwan has been so robust, is because that ecosystem, that superconductor industry, has been a long-standing industry, or a long-standing ecosystem. Same thing with Silicon Valley. Can Europe start to forge the makings of its own sort of nascent homegrown commercial sector in an effort to really compete in the launch space? I don't know. It's a question,
And I think some European space officials have acknowledged, like, hey, this is going to take time. It's going to take years and years, maybe not a decade, but certainly more than a couple years to really develop some of those pockets that you talked about, and to have the real business heft that might be necessary to sustain the industry long term.
Yeah. I mean, I still think when I think rockets in Germany, I still think Werner von Braun and the V2 program. So, it's like that legacy and that deep imprint of the history there has to shift still. Perhaps it's the same case in the United States with the Apollo program, but I don't think so. I think the sense of that commercial impetus now has sort of taken hold, in which when people think about that space, they think about SpaceX, they think about Blue Origin, they think about companies like Rocket Lab and Intuitive Machines. It's less maybe that old legacy stuff, whereas Europe is a little bit different. But
yeah, and Ariane Spas wants to get in on that, and I think we're seeing others where, hey, they really want to they want to make their own name there, and we'll see. Like I said, this is how we started with. We'll see in the next 6 months to a year how these topics play out.
Yeah. All right. I want to transition gears here to some of these, deeper science questions that so we dig into. I love these, Mike. This past week, scientists detected what was sort of unexpected oxygen in a galaxy that James Webb telescope had found not too long ago. It was actually the most distant galaxy ever found, and they did this with the Atacama Large Array in the Chilean desert. But what they found was evidence, like I said, of oxygen. And I guess why that matters is that typically in these really early galaxies that were formed, you just don't usually find these heavier elements, right? You tend to find the lighter ones like hydrogen and helium, and the heavier ones kind of come after those first stars form and initiate some degree of nuclear fusion. And so I think looking at this, and I should also mention, this is a galaxy that it takes 13.4 billion years to reach us, for light to reach us. So when you stare at this galaxy, you're looking at a galaxy that was just coming into an existence only when the universe was around 300 million years old. So this is just like a snapshot after the Big Bang. And so I think what it it points to is sort of like these questions about what we think we know about the early origins of the universe, and what we're stored at kind of like rapidly beginning to find out by virtue of some of these more advanced telescopes. And going forward, how does that play out in sort of NASA's sort of more long-term, or at least hallmark missions of exploring science for the sake of science, and how does that fit into commercial space? Because I think there's almost like this tension now between the two of these things. Because I don't know how to operationalize what I just told you in terms of the commercial sector by any stretch, but it matters in terms of discovering maybe some trickle-down effects. So I think that's almost the fundamental question we always try to suss out in this podcast. It's like where's this new direction of the agency, and how does it fit into sort of those hallmark goals?
Yeah, and there is one thing we love to talk about here is wonder, and there is that sense of wonder certainly with a story like that. But you're right, it gets hard to commercialize, and you can see certainly like, all right, well, you could operationalize some of the telescopes, or maybe they could be used for other purposes. But it's very, 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 very difficult, but it is also it's fascinating to dream about and to get your imagination going.
Well, there's one actually other story that I wanted to mention, which actually does have a commercial application that's more clear cut, and it stems off some of the work that was being done on the NASA's Cold Atom Lab last year on the ISS, which they're calling this sort of the coolest experiment in space, sort of literally, right? This is sort of a pun, but it's like using these ultra cold atoms as a means of sensing gravity. So these are quantum sensors that are developed. Quantum sensing is not new necessarily, but as it relates to space and how it's being applied is. And so you sort of measure gravity and magnetic fields at an atomic level. So like, why does this matter, right? If different things have different mass densities, then those densities correspond to different gravitational fields. And so if you can have a quantum sensor that detects those like infinitesimal differences between things, you can start to figure out, oh, is there water on that asteroid? Is there gold? Like, are there these lava tubes? Like, I can precisely map some of the lava tubes that are on the moon and Mars, and places where scientists are devising for potential human settlements. And to think about that, to like measure gravity at atomic levels as a way of mapping, and how this plays into our own like broader surveillance efforts of both the Earth, but also deep space, and how this might be used in other forms of quantum activities, whether it's atomic clocks or we're kind of in this brave new world of quantum activity now, and you're seeing the commercial sector get involved in a much more different way. And I think that's the rub, right? That's the go-between, because it's like, how does the commercial sector give this the oomph that it might need to compete in global markets, certainly in geopolitical competitions. It seems like we're really at the vanguard of a brave new world here.
Yeah, and I think it's what you talked about there. I think quantum is hard to explain, right? It's hard to understand, but I think it's when we see those applications and then how those can trickle down, how those can have multiple effects, that's where they can really make a difference. My go-to example is always GPS. We talked a couple of weeks ago on the show about how GPS has such a huge economic impact on agriculture, but I don't think that's what anyone had in mind when it started as a military program. So it's these second and third order effects, the actual applications that I think will just be really probably mind-boggling to us in not so long.
Yeah, so the insidious effects or the nature of space in ways that you don't even realize are sort of your day to day.
Yeah. Great. Well, those were some fun stories. Thanks so much for joining, everyone. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of Space Minds. I'm Mike Bruce.
And I'm David Ariosto. Thanks for watching. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time here on Space Minds.